May the Word of God continue to shine for us today as we spend this time together. The opening of sermons was supposed to be attention getters, jokes, stories, something contemporary, maybe something shocking, something that grabs the attention of the audience. So here's my attention getter statement, and just in case you miss it, okay? This may be a very short sermon. Helen and I just returned from a week in Philly with our daughter and son-in-law and grandson, Connor. As the week went on, Connor's cold got better, and ours got worse. And we've tested, and we do not have COVID. And they had tested before we arrived. But I haven't felt well, and so this may be short. It may not. Let me see. When Adam and I and others who preach, when we usually look at the Revised Common Lectionary. It's scriptures that two of the scriptures from that are the scriptures that Leslie read this morning. There are like four options there, four passages of scripture, and there's usually an Old Testament writing, a reading. There's a psalm. There's a New Testament reading, probably most often from the epistles, occasionally from Acts, sometimes from Revelation, but most of the time from the epistles. And then there's a gospel reading. And so when preachers that are using the lectionary, they look at that and they say, which of these will I, sort of strike me? Which one does it seem that pulls me? Which one of these speak to me? And so when I read Micah 6, I was struck by three things actually. One I was struck by was the poetic language that the prophet Micah uses in that verse, in that chapter. He said, "Hear what the Lord says. Rise, plead your case before the mountains, and let the hills hear your voice. Hear, you mountains, the controversy of the Lord, and you enduring foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will contend with Israel." And I was reminded, I usually am not drawn to the prophets, but I was reminded of that there's a purpose for the prophets, the writings of the prophets to be in there, and to me it's a bit amazing that they were saved, because they are so counterculture, and there may have been many other writings by prophets, but the ones that were probably saved were the ones that later at the end of the story they said, "Oh, this really did happen," and so it was included in the Hebrew scriptures. But when I read this passage, I read those first two verses and I thought, talk to the mountains. Micah is saying to the people that he's prophesying to, who is people that have broken their connection with God, and who have gone in a different, are going in a different direction from the direction that God intended for them to go. And Micah is saying, you can get this straight. We can get this worked out. But he says, talk to the mountains. Now, when I first read that, I sort of went through a process of three or four possibilities of what that meant. One of them was, is he saying to the people, you're frustrated, go out and shout to the mountains. Sort of a little bit of primal scream kind of thing. Have you ever shouted to the mountains? I've shouted in my walls sometimes. I've shouted, I've been in my car, I've shouted to the windshield. Certainly shouted to the other people driving. So my first thought was, maybe he's saying, if you're frustrated, go shout to the mountains. Go shout to the mountains. And then I realized that's really not what it's saying. And then I thought, well, maybe he's saying, shout go bring your concerns to the mountains, because up in the mountains were high holy places, and there were places where God was thought to be special, especially there. And so maybe he was saying, go to the mountains, take your concerns to the mountains. But as I read, I thought that's not it either. Another thought I had, there was before some of you were born, but you've probably seen people do this and say this. Sometimes when people are out of touch, are dissing you, or they're criticizing you, or they're nagging you. Sometimes there was a time back in the 1980s and 90s where people would say, "Talk to the hand." Does anybody ever say that anymore? No. And I was wondering as I read this, was Micah saying to the people, go talk to the mountains. You got a concern, go talk to the hand. Mountains aren't going to hear it, But if you read carefully, what's being said here is, in a poetic way, is that the people of God who have drifted away and who have rebelled against God, you can go and you can talk to the mountains and to the hills and to the structures of the earth, because they've been there all this time and they bear witness. They've seen it. And they know that God has been good to you, to them. God has done what God promised to do. And then in the passage, there are a couple of sort of historical kind of narratives there. One is Micah reminds the people that God brought them out of Egypt. And then also that God reminds people of an incident with Balaam and when God acted, and he's saying, remember these things. And then he gives these instructions. How do you get back right? How do is it through doing the right rituals? Is that how you get back right with God? And is it through the things that you said, the amount of the sacrifice? Is that how you do it? And then, when I was reading this for the first time in years, it's been many years, I realized that in this passage, in this chapter, was that beautiful passage that so many people had told me was their favorite passage. He has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, something that may be the favorite passage for a number of you. I don't know. But when I read that passage, I think of Beth, because I've heard Beth say that a number of times. So I asked her if she would mind sharing a little bit of what that scripture means to her. So we have a dual sermon going here. Beth, would you come and share?
Well, since Ken said he would have limited words, like, I love a good soapbox, so sit back and relax. I do love that passage. And I also did a little looking into Micah. Who is Micah? He's one of our minor prophets, and that just makes me think, like, how good do you have to be not a minor? Like, we have a church in town, James the Lesser, and I always wondered, does James the Lesser have an inferiority complex? And I kind of think calling Micah one of our minor prophets kind of creates the same sort of thing in my mind. But he was a contemporary of Isaiah, and Isaiah, like 700 BC, and he was talking to the folks of Jerusalem, encouraging them to get their act together, because what he saw was a whole bunch of what we see throughout time. It's like we humans never learn the lesson, like money and power can be very corrupting, and people had lost their way. And so he did indeed prophesy about the fall of Jerusalem. He also prophesied that a Messiah would come from Bethlehem. He was kind of right on with that one, it turns out, later on. But one of the first sermons I ever gave, which was a very daunting undertaking, was when I was president of Neighborhood Services, and we installed our new executive director at the time. And so my very first sermon was on Micah, this passage, because it speaks to me very clearly about the work of Neighborhood Services, the food pantry that we helped found and that we continue to support, in which we never use the term client. Everyone is a neighbor. Neighbors are those that come for food. Neighbors are those that bring food. Neighbors are those who volunteer. And neighbors are those who write major checks. So regardless of, what kind of hunger Neighborhood Services feeds on your part, they're all neighbors. And that, to me, kind of capsulizes this way of looking at how do we think about what God is expecting of us. I used to ask the question all the time, what does the Lord require? Many of you know that my mother became very ill when I was in college. She had severe onset, early onset, non-responsive Parkinson's disease, and she spent her last 18 years in a nursing home, totally paralyzed. She couldn't scratch her nose. She was not always communicative, and I would just say, dear God, how good do I have to be in terms of driving to Marion and back when I might be there for just 2 minutes to give her a kiss, and she would be very disturbed and say, you need to go. I had a very demanding job at the time, so how good of a daughter do I need to be? How many trips to Marion a week do I have to make to meet the requirements of what God might say a good daughter is? I then learned that I was asking the wrong question. The question isn't, how good do we all have to be? Because we're all good enough just as we are. We're all good enough doing the best that we can. But what does the Lord require? And this is such a simple and freeing lesson and way to look at it for me, is to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. It's not how many calves a month that you sacrifice on an altar. There is no matrix to check the boxes. It's not about how big of a cross you wear on the outside of your sweater, looking quite pious and noble when you walk around town, because none of that matters if, in the way you're treating others, it doesn't reflect just judgment, justice, kindness, and walking humbly. I used to work in the state public defender's office. I helped fund civil legal services for the poor, and right now I work with the Attorney General's office helping to make the charitable sector more firm. And so I believe in justice to the core of my being, whether it applies to those on death row, those who are walking the streets, those who have little. And Micah, there's a lot of evidence came from a real hard-scrabble life, a lower economic class who he got his hands dirty. He certainly saw people being mistreated and abused by those who had more. And so that also motivated part of his message. And so justice is something that we can do in so many different ways. Being concerned about the upcoming state budget. How are we educating our children? How are we taking care of the least of these? And then what can we do indirectly and directly about it? And I've learned so much about that here at University Baptist Church. I did a Rotary Fellowship to the Southern Philippines years ago. And Mary Riley, who is Jonathan and Oliva's mother, said, when you go to Iloilo, which by the way is where Central Philippines University is and where we send our annual Abigail Bunker Scholarship Funds, when you're there, you've got to get together with George Tamayo. He came here in the 60s as a graduate student, and you must get together with George Tamayo. I was like, I was not around here in the 60s. He's not going to know who I am. But when Mary Riley tells you to do something, you do it. And so as soon as I got to, well, actually as soon as I got to the city and I told my host family that I wanted to see George Tamayo while I was there, they said, oh, he is a Baptist. He is very honest. Now this is a Roman Catholic nation. It's just dripping with Catholicism. And to say, oh, he's a Baptist, he's very honest, kind of startled me. So I then did connect up with George Tamayo, who then went to many Rotary meetings with me all over Iloilo to talk about the acts of justice of Bill and Mary Riley, who when he came here as a graduate student had difficulty finding housing as a person of color, which angered Bill and Mary Riley. And Bill would go from building to building with George Tamayo and look the landlords in the face like, why will you not let him have a room? And then they eventually started investing in properties for international students. Now imagine having people all over the globe hearing a story about your witness to justice in that way. Bill and Mary Riley were prophets. They taught me, as well as others, who have come in and out of the doors of this small but great church, what doing justice is like. And so I take inspiration from those kinds of acts. We all aren't going to have our names repeated over the decades as being prophets of justice, but we can indeed take inspiration and do our small part. Now the second part of Micah's 3-step program, and again, like I was just talking to someone who had recently been to a Narcotics Anonymous meeting. They employ a 12-step program which has saved the lives of many people around the globe. This is even easier, what Micah offers. It's simply a 3-step program. Do justice, love kindness. Who doesn't love kindness? It's the lesson our parents taught us, our teachers taught us. Like if there's a question about how to behave, just do the kind thing. What would Jesus do? Which I never did have one of those bracelets, but it's not a bad test. It's not a bad screen to use. What is then problematic is when you have the giant cross and the What Would Jesus Do bracelet, and you're being cruel and heartless to homeless people as you walk down the street. That's a misalignment. And I have seen that happen with friends of mine. And I haven't been invited back to their picnics. But the 3rd step, probably because I violated the 3rd step in that situation, is to walk humbly. So, walking humbly with God, to me says, you know what? It's okay to have questions. It's okay to ponder the power of God. Have questions one day, come to some understanding, and then a month later, revisit it, and maybe go in a different direction. God doesn't ask us to be brainless. So walking humbly means that we may all come to different understandings of what we're called to do as Christians at different times in our life. And I always worry the most about people who have really strong views about the rightness and wrongness of their actions as Christians. Those that leave no room for questions, I sometimes scratch my head the most over. And as I get older, sometimes I think the less I know. So walking humbly in that way is something I'm getting much better at doing as I get older. And I was young once. I thought I knew everything. It turns out I didn't really. I knew some things. But maybe my parents weren't as dumb as I thought they were at the time. So I meant to, but my husband was asleep this morning, so I didn't want to wake him when I left. But I have this, remember when you could go get little leather bracelets and they would pound your name into them? I have one that I had made that says, do justice, love kindness, walk humbly. And I was going to wear that this morning, but I didn't want to wake John up. So it's always been this constant reminder for me, like, that this is a very simple plan. I'm not going to be perfect at it all the time, but I'm a simple person. Don't ask me about the nature of the Trinity. Don't ask me how that magic works. Talk to someone who knows a lot more of that sort of very heavy liturgical kinds of things. But what I can tell you is that if you aim to follow Micah, who was a simple minor prophet, do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly, I think you'll find in your heart that you can sleep pretty well at night and wake up the next morning and try it all again and keep going with it. And so that is a constant reminder to me, and it's one that's made my life a bit easier. I do not succeed. I am not always humble, and I'm not always kind, but I'm working at it. And that's what the job of a Christian is to continually work at it. So, Pastor Ken, that's what I have.
Wow, thank you, Pat. We're living in this week. This week is a week when we have seen a lot of injustice on the television, on the news, and we've seen a lack of kindness. And so it seems good that this fell where it did, to remind us that we are to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly. Richard Rohr is a Franciscan that many of us read his daily devotionals. And he said that there are two great strains of spiritual teachers in Judaism, and I think if the truth is told in all religions, there's a priestly strain that holds the system together by repeating the tradition. The one we're less familiar with is the prophetic strain, because that one hasn't been quite as accepted. Prophets are critical of the very system that the priests maintain. He says we're living in a most amazing time. We have it in Pope Francis right now. We very seldom have a pope who is also a prophet, who holds the tradition together, respects and conserves the tradition, but at the same time is often quite critical of the bishops and the priests, as he well should be. The only way, says Rohr, the only way evil can succeed is to disguise itself as good. And one of the best disguises for evil is religion. Just pretend to love God. Go to church every Sunday. Recite the creed. And say all the right things. Someone can be racist, be against the poor, hate immigrants, and be totally concerned about making money and being a materialist, but still go to church each Sunday and be justified in the eyes of religion. Those are the things that prophets point out. So prophets aren't nearly as popular as priests. Priests keep repeating the party line, so there's no reason to fight them. But prophets do both. They put together the best of the conservative with the best of the liberal. To use contemporary language, They honor the tradition, and they also say what's phony about the tradition. That's what fully spiritually mature people can do. I was thinking, one thing that I can share, which I was impressed with, this past semester I went to a big table meeting, some of they call it big table, where there were people there that were invited, campus ministers were invited, students were invited. We sat and there were a number of big tables in the room. And Gene Smith, the athletic director at OSU, was one of the hosts. And he said, it just sort of in passing, he says, one of the things I say to all of our football players, all our athletes, is be kind. It is such an easy thing to be kind. May God, as we conclude this portion of the service, may God help us to see injustice and to speak out against it and to act against it. And help us to be kind. And fill us